Okay, so have you ever noticed how, like, right when you're about to make a decision, suddenly, bam, that little voice of guilt pops up?
Oh,
It's
totally.
like it slams on the brakes.
Yeah.
So today, we are diving deep into guilt,
Mhm.
trying to figure out if it's actually helpful or, if it's holding us back.
Right.
And we're going to be looking at Guion Manager Culpa, which, by the way, has some seriously practical advice.
It's interesting. We often talk about guilt like it's a bad thing,
Yeah,
but it's actually really connected to our values, don't you think?
it is.
Like this text really digs into understanding why we actually feel guilty in the first place and how that's the key to moving past it.
I love that
Yeah.
because it's not just about feeling bad, right? It's about figuring out what that bad feeling is trying to tell us.
Exactly.
So, like, how does this source actually define guilt?
Well, it starts by saying guilt kicks in, when we think we've messed up somehow,
Hmm.
whether it's by our own standards or somebody else's. But here's where it gets kind of interesting. The text argues that guilt actually has a purpose.
It's not just there to, like, torture us.
Okay. I'm all for less mental torture. So what's the purpose?
Well, think of it kind of like a signal,
Okay.
a mental alarm bell.
Mhm.
It's basically telling us you might have strayed from your values or you did something that caused some harm.
Okay.
But that in itself can be good, right?
Yeah.
Because it means we're self-aware and we care about doing the right thing.
Okay, so it's like a built-in moral compass.
Exactly.
But the source also talks about healthy versus destructive guilt, which is where I think things get kind of tricky.
Yeah, for sure. It's
Does-
like psychologist Dr. Harriet Lerner once said, guilt, when it's constructive, is a signal of our conscience. When it's destructive, it imprisons us in the past.
Oh, wow.
So figuring out what kind of guilt we're dealing with is really essential.
Yeah. And I think that brings us to those 5 actionable strategies from this text,
Yeah.
which, by the way, I am so ready to, break free from guilt's prison.
But let's start with strategy number 1, which the source calls accept responsibility, but don't punish. Now, that might sound a little counterintuitive
It does.
because it's not about letting yourself off the hook.
Right.
It's about acknowledging what you did, but not, like, spiraling.
Yeah, it's about not going into self-flagellation mode. This is where self-compassion comes in.
Okay, so how do we actually practice that
Mm-hmm.
when we're, like, in it?
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes it feels impossible.
Imagine you're talking to a close friend
Okay.
and they made a similar mistake. You'd offer them understanding and support, right?
Of course.
Self-compassion is about giving that same kindness to ourselves.
Oh,
And get this, there's actually this 2018 University of Michigan study, and they found that people who are kinder to themselves, they experience less of that destructive guilt, and they're better at actually finding solutions to their problems.
it's true. You can't really brainstorm your way out of something when you're too busy beating yourself up about it.
Mhm.
So it's more about reframing guilt as a learning moment.
Yes, precisely.
Okay.
Instead of asking yourself, why am I so terrible? Try shifting to, what can I learn from this experience? How can I, actually grow from this?
Oh, that's a much more productive question, for sure.
Hmm.
And speaking of putting things in perspective, that actually leads us to the next strategy in the text. Put guilt in perspective.
Right.
Because sometimes those guilty feelings can feel massive.
Oh, absolutely. They can feel huge.
Right.
Yeah. But here's the thing. Our emotional responses aren't just about what actually happened. It's also about how we're interpreting it,
Mhm.
Remember Dr. Albert Ellis and his work on how we give meaning to different events?
Okay, wait. Refresh my memory on that.
Basically, he was saying that we have a lot more control over our emotions than we think.
Okay.
If we're just drowning in guilt, it's worth asking if our interpretation of the situation is actually accurate. Are we, taking on more blame than we should?
So are we truly responsible for absolutely everything? Or are we maybe being a little hard on ourselves?
Right. It's like a reality check for guilt. Yeah. Okay, this is great stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But what about when that guilt makes you feel like you're just totally alone, like you cannot talk to anyone about it?
Yeah.
That's where the next strategy comes in, right?
That's exactly where it comes in, yeah.
Talking it out.
You got it.
Okay.
The text emphasizes how powerful it is to just share those feelings with somebody we trust. And this isn't just like fluffy advice. There's actually science behind this.
Oh, really?
Yeah. A 2017 Stanford study found that talking about difficult emotions, guilt included, actually reduces stress.
Mm.
Bottling it up just makes everything so much worse.
That makes sense. Even if the person you're talking to doesn't have the answers, just saying the words out loud can be a huge relief.
Oh, 100%. And just to clarify, it doesn't even have to be a therapist,
Okay, good to know.
although that is always a great option.
Yeah.
The important thing is that you find someone who listens without judgment, someone who validates what you're going through. Ooh, like an emotional sounding board.
Yes, exactly.
Someone to help process those like messy feelings.
Yes.
Okay. On to strategy number 4.
Mm.
And this one is all about self-forgiveness,
Mm.
which honestly, sometimes even after you talk it out, you're still kind of left with that feeling of, oof, I messed up.
Yeah. We can be our own worst critics.
Oh, worst.
But this text makes a really good point. Self-forgiveness doesn't mean pretending that the mistake never happened. It's about letting go of that judgment that keeps us stuck.
Right. So it's not saying, oh, no harm, no foul. It's more like, okay, I see where I messed up, but I'm going to learn from this instead of just constantly beating myself up.
Exactly. It's like Dr. Kristen Neff, who literally wrote the book on self-compassion.
Oh, wow.
She says, self-compassion is not being indulgent with oneself. It's being kind to yourself instead of punishing yourself.
Mm.
Think about how you would treat someone you love if they made a similar mistake.
I mean, you'd be supportive, understanding, definitely not giving them a lecture, that's for sure.
Exactly.
Okay, so we need to give ourselves that same grace. But that's like a million times easier said than done. So how do we actually do that, especially when it feels like we've really messed up?
It's definitely a process,
Yeah.
and it takes time, which is why this final strategy is so important. Learn and move forward.
Okay.
This text emphasizes that guilt, it can teach us some really important lessons, but it shouldn't turn into like a life sentence.
Right. So take the lesson, but don't keep reliving the mistake.
Exactly. It's about progress, not perfection.
I love that.
Yeah, I love the analogy that Dr. Henry Cloud uses. He says, guilt can be a compass, but it shouldn't be a prison. It points us in the right direction, but it shouldn't keep us trapped.
Okay, I love that. Guilt as a compass, not a prison. But how do we actually break free from that mental prison,
It comes down to action.
Okay.
Like, all of this understanding is great, but it's only useful if we actually apply it.
Right.
It's like reading a cookbook and never making anything.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's about turning this into concrete steps.
Yeah.
So what would that look like for someone who's like, all right, I'm ready to ditch the guilt?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
So, like, what's one tiny step you can take today based on what we've been talking about?
Okay.
It could be writing down some of those negative thoughts, challenging them, or trying out a quick self-compassion meditation.
Mm-hmm.
Even the tiniest actions can create momentum.
It's true. It's like you don't start by bench pressing your body weight. You got to work those muscles up.
Exactly. And honestly, don't underestimate the power of celebrating those small victories.
Oh, yeah.
Every step forward, no matter how small, deserves to be celebrated.
It's about progress, not perfection.
Okay, so to recap this awesome deep dive into Guion Mano Culpa, guilt's not the enemy. It's how we respond to it that makes all the difference. We've got 5 practical strategies now. Accepting responsibility without punishing yourself, putting that guilt in perspective, talking it out, with someone you trust, practicing self-forgiveness, and then committing to learning and moving forward.
It's like we have a game plan now.
We do.
But let's be real, it's probably going to pop up again.
Oh, absolutely. It will.
We're human.
We're all works in progress, always learning, always growing.
Yep.
And that's more than okay. So as you reflect on these strategies, what resonates most with you? What feels like it could make a real difference for you?
That's a great question.
Okay.
And remember, there's no right or wrong answer. Experiment with these strategies, figure out what works for you, and be kind to yourself along the way. Until next time, happy diving. It's
Yep.
like we have a game plan now.
We do.
But let's be real, it's probably going to pop up again.
Oh, absolutely it will. We're
Right.
human. We're all works in progress, always learning, always growing. And that's more than okay. So as you reflect on these strategies, what resonates most with you? What feels like it could make a real difference for you?
That's a great question. And remember, there's no right or wrong answer. Experiment with these strategies, figure out what works for you, and be kind to yourself along the way. Until next time, happy diving.